Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Grief Book Roundup. Today, I bring you Confessions of a Funeral Director by Caleb Wilde. And from its title, you might think that this book is a gory unveiling of the inner workings of a funeral home, and there are discussions of things like embalming and things of that nature. But actually, Confessions of a Funeral Director is a lot more about a beautiful exploration of the spiritual and human elements of living with a constant awareness of and appreciation for, as strange as that sounds, death. In this book, Caleb Wilde details his early recognition of mortality as a child growing up a sixth-generation funeral home kid, his exploration of how to best serve people in a world where everyone is inevitably going to die, his reckoning with Christianity's view on death, and the creative, heartfelt lessons that his funeral home clients have taught him about the ways we grieve. This collection of essays that's more or less chronological is a meaningful invitation to death positivity in a society and in an industry that is largely averse to death. And I especially don't want you to miss the epilogue, which is called 10 Confessions, because this is a section where Caleb Wilde shares 10 truths about the spirituality of death, including rule number 1, let death show you goodness, and number 5, let us embrace silence rather than trying to needlessly fill it. If I had to pick 3 words to describe the book, they are thoughtful, introspective, and observant. Something I love about Caleb Wilde is you can tell this man is an introvert. The way he writes the book, the way he tells the story, the way that he sees the clients and the families and the community members that he's working with, he doesn't just absorb the experience that's happening on the surface. He wonders about and examines the experience happening underneath. And then he applies his own lessons, the introspective part, what he was taught through his faith, through his upbringing, through his experience as a funeral home kid and then a funeral home member. And just this level of observance that he has about people and about death and about humanity is very great. And it's what makes him a good writer, but it's also what makes this book a delight to read. Losses including this book, Confessions of a Funeral Director, covers a wide range of losses, and for the most part, they all center around death and mortality. There are stories recounting the death of a baby, death due to addiction, sudden death, traumatic death, and the deaths of Caleb Wilde's respective grandparents. But beyond death, Confessions of a Funeral Director also wrestles with loss of faith, especially as it pertains to the death of a God that punishes and a God that rewards, and a stepping in of a different kind of God and religion. The loss of energy and subsequent burnout related to compassion fatigue as a death care worker, and also loss surrounding the grief of infertility. some of my favorite quotes in this book. I'd love to share two of them with you. The first comes from page 37. It reads, "Death asks us to pause. It doesn't tell us what we need to do when we pause. There may be nothing to do at all, but it asks us to be in its presence, to sit with it, listen to it." The next quote comes from page 138. Caleb Wilde writes, "The continuing relationship with the dead is a tension that few of us want to acknowledge. A person, we say, is either dead or alive, and anything else is simply too uncomfortable for our binary minds to grasp. But death doesn't bring certainties. It brings silence, and often it brings with it a liminality of being in the in-between, a place that exists where life and death mix, not always in discord, but sometimes in a harmonious ecosystem. These spaces shouldn't be closed off or avoided or reduced to simple, outdated spirituality, but embraced through what I like to call active remembrance, a space where the dead are actively and intentionally remembered." And this comes from one of my favorite chapters that Wilde writes about this idea that he holds about active remembrance. He talks about passive remembrance being like when you stumble across a photo of a loved one or see something that reminds you of them, so you're not trying to remember people in the present. But he shares this concept, this alternative called active remembrance, where we fold people we love who have died into our everyday lives so that they are mosaics of us. We are all mosaics of each other. And it's one of the most beautiful chapters in Confessions of a Funeral Director that I return to over and over again. So if you're looking for a more positive slant on death and dying, a different kind of spirituality regarding mortality, I hope you'll pick up a copy of Confessions of a Funeral Director. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.